And now it is my pleasure and delight to introduce Dr. Caroline Light, a historian who is a faculty member and director of undergraduate studies in the program in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Harvard University. She has done groundbreaking, and I would also add especially timely research on the ways in which race, gender, and geographical region in the U.S. shape collective memory, mismemory, and archival silences. Her two most recent books are That Pride of Race and Character, The Roots of Jewish Benevolence in the Jim Crow South, which appeared in 2014 with NYU Press, and her more recent book, Stand Your Ground, A History of America's Love Affair with Lethal Self-Defense, which appeared in 2017 with Beacon Press. So I'm delighted again to welcome Dr. Light to the Twin Cities, and please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much, Leslie. I also want to thank Mario Coulter as well for her organizational genius in making all this happen. Thanks so much to the Center for Jewish Studies and the History Department, and above all to Mount Zion for hosting, and my very dear friend Adam Stock-Spilker for making all of this come together so beautifully. I'm honored to be here, and I'm so grateful that all of you came out tonight on this cold night. Can you hear me okay in the back? All right, if you can't, you raise your hand, make some gesture, I will speak up. All right, so as Leslie mentioned, my earlier book was on the Jewish South, specifically focused on benevolence. And I used a historian's lens on two orphan homes in the South. And so I'm always very excited to revisit this work because there were many things that I found very difficult to include in the book. So what I'm presenting to you tonight are some of the things that I could not include in the book. It wasn't just that I didn't have the space or that I couldn't add more photographs or whatever in the book. It was also that in terms of historical methodologies, there are some parts of the study of the Jewish South that are very elusive, and you'll soon find out why. So part of my great joy in speaking to you tonight is to present some work that is really meaningful and important to me, but I was not able to include within the confines of my book as it was imagined. So first thing I want to say is that these are these two orphan homes that many people I find, if they're not from the South and if they're not Jewish, don't even know that these orphan homes existed. But there was one in New Orleans and one in Atlanta. This is an image from the Atlanta Hebrew orphan home. Yes, indeed, they had a skating rink. And what I discovered in my study, and this is part of my doctoral research, is that Jewish orphan homes in general, and in the South in particular, were vital spaces for cultivating ideal citizenship, specifically ideal Jewish citizenship, especially in a place that was very precarious in terms of the way in which Jews imagined themselves and had to navigate the dangers of the color line. So I'm talking about the Jim Crow South, and I'm also talking about a specific effort to cultivate ideal citizens in this really difficult space. So I want to start with a primary document. There are really only 3 extant oral histories that I was able to find from the Hebrew Orphans Home of Atlanta. So I'm going to read you a quick excerpt from one of them. This was an oral interview conducted in 1991 with a former inmate, and they were called inmates at the time. Simon Schur was his name. He lived in the orphan home of Atlanta from 1914 to 1922. At this point, this is a small excerpt from his oral history, the interviewer was asking him about his daily life at the home. So what was it like to live there on a daily basis? So the interviewer says, "What were some of the chores they had you do at the home?" Simon answered, "Well, my job at the time when I became old enough was taking care of the pantry. I would dish out the food to the cook. The cook was an old ex-Civil War slave named Aunt Fanny, they called her, and she used to always tell me that I reminded her of her old master, Simon. And I don't know whether it's something I should be proud of or not," at which point he laughed. "But those were the stories she used to tell me about the old slave days." The interviewer asks, "Did she tell you, what kinds of stories did she tell you?" And Simon responded, "I don't really recall too much what she told me. I think my interests were too far away from that." "But she was willing to share that sort of thing with you?" Oh yeah, but of course, I was closer to her than I was to some of the others because I had to give her the food and stuff and dish it out to be cooked and served." And finally, "Was she there the whole time that you were in the home?" And Simon responded, "I believe so. You know, she sort of fades out somewhere there, and I really don't remember." So this small excerpt of an oral history given some 70 years after the fact reveals a rare glimpse of the point of intersection and engagement between Fanny Young, a woman born into slavery in 1854 in Georgia, I got that information from the census, and a young motherless boy, Simon Scherer, the son of East European immigrants who arrived in the United States speaking Yiddish. We do not possess a record of Mrs. Young's perspective on her relationship with Simon or the other children of the Atlanta home, and Simon didn't expand upon the content of the stories that she shared with him about the old slave days. He suggested that he was closer to her because of their working relationship, and his narrative suggests some fondness on his part. And yet, his laughter at the memory of Aunt Fanny's comment about his resemblance to her old master suggests Simon's recognition of the ways in which racial politics had changed over 70 years. It's possible that as an aging Southern white man, Mr. Scherer experienced a bit of unease over this recollection of being compared to a slave master, and also to the elderly Black woman's oblique critique of a small child's supervisory power over her. When pressed for details about Ms. Young's experience of slavery, Simon Scherer could not remember. His decades-removed memory of Fanny Young sort of faded out. So my research on Southern Jewish history addresses the elusive content of these partial memories and the histories that fade out of individual and collective consciousness. Specifically, I track the past, the traces of the past that don't always appear obvious to us in the traditional archives. This is where my studies of the Jewish South ended up departing from many traditional historical methodologies. I've studied Southern Jewish history for over 2 decades, and I learned over time to seek out silences in the archive, to read between the lines for insight into the complex structures of power beyond what appears on the surface of the evidence by which traditional historians tend to determine the truth of our past. So I share that vignette with you for 2 reasons. First of all, it's rare. There aren't a lot of oral histories, unfortunately, of people who actually lived in these orphan homes. There were 2 homes, as I mentioned, New Orleans and Atlanta. In my research, very few oral histories. I did find in the New Orleans, not the New Orleans home, the Atlanta home, multiple social work records. So there's a really rich treasure trove of records on the children who lived in the Hebrew Orphans home of Atlanta. Unfortunately, most of the records at New Orleans were lost through natural disasters. So more generally, the archives are limited sources of insight into the ways in which people who tried to self-identify as white, who struggled with that ability to identify as white citizens of the Jim Crow South, navigated a shifting and highly precarious racial terrain. I found that the archives offer us significant insight on class and the gender and sex norms that young children, that the inmates of the home were taught, but the pedagogies of race are more elusive to track. Yet these pedagogies, how to learn to be white, to be seen as a white citizen of the South, were absolutely crucial to the efforts of Jewish communities to survive in this space and time. Also, the story gives insight into this very close interracial, ambivalent intimacy that develops in the Jim Crow South in these private spaces. While the dominant Southern culture was based on the fiction of racial separation, In fact, I find through my research that there's significant mixing and interdependency between the races in private space. It's just harder to trace because it's contained in these private homes that aren't often open to the public eye or available to historical study. So my purpose is to take you back in time to the Jim Crow South, or maybe Souths plural, because it's more accurate to think of it as multiple Souths rather than one monolithic South. The states of the former Confederacy were not united by one specific dominant culture or set of collective memories that designate Southernness, or really one exclusionary regime by which whiteness was defined against other types of racialities that were minoritized. But rather, I want to look at these two homes as exemplars of the development of cultural capital, and I'll explain more what I mean by that, in Southern Jewish orphan homes. The way in which these two communities struggled to support the children of impoverished co-religionists who are mostly foreign-born. So first of all, why the Jewish South? Why study the South, and why study Jewish culture in the South? And typically when I talk about this work and I'm not in the South, I tend to get a lot of questions about whether there was even a significant Jewish presence in the South. And so this is the first mythology I set out to challenge in my research. I discovered that actually the South has a very rich history, particularly as the site of the first organized benevolent institution, Southern Jewish Benevolent Institution. Years before New York established a benevolent organization, Charleston, South Carolina, was actually the first. So this is the seal from the establishment in 1784 in Charleston of the Hebrew Benevolent Association that would be the very first one in the United States. And the seal reads, "Charity delivereth from death." And indeed, when you really look at it, when you go back in time, you can see that the first Jewish settlements were really quite robust in colonies like Georgia and the Carolinas that were relatively more tolerant, or perhaps less intolerant, of religious and cultural pluralism than many others, especially northern colonies. So I can talk about this more if you would like, but what I want to say is that by around 1820, approximately half of the nation's Jewish population lived in the South, with the largest Jewish community of approximately 500 people living in Charleston, South Carolina. So actually, this is the root of Jewish benevolence in the United States. It's in the South. So that changes very quickly with the arrival of new immigrant groups that are going to settle mostly in the Northeast. By 1900, the percentage of Jews in the South had fallen to less than 10% of the nation's whole. By around the eve of the Civil War, only around 20 to 25,000 Jewish people lived in the states of the Confederacy, with approximately 8,000 concentrated at that time in Louisiana. So that's just to give you a sense of how the demographic shifted so much over time to where really more Jews were concentrated in the North and the Northeast. So in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, this is the period that I focus on in my research, it was a significant time of transformation for the nation and for the South in particular. So the approximately, say, 25,000 Jews who called the South home in the late 19th century saw their social stability and their authenticity shaken significantly by the arrival of over 40,000 East European co-religionists. So this 40,000 some people was statistically a very tiny portion of that massive so-called second wave of immigration that came from Eastern Europe, with well over 1 million Jews coming from Russia, Austria-Hungary, from Romania, beginning in about the 1880s, escaping anti-Semitism and poverty to come to the United States and predominantly settling in the Northeast. However, in the South, this arrival of some 40,000 people coincides with what Rayford Logan termed the nadir of race relations in the South. By nadir, he means this is the peak at which racial violence, from riots to lynchings to the solidification of the color line, the proliferation of Jim Crow legislation, was taking root in the South. So this was the same time. It was also a time of economic upheaval resulting from the reverberative effects of the Civil War, which disproportionately affected the South. So this was a time of great upheaval, and certainly it was vital for the established Jewish community in the South to answer the extreme amount of need there was among this new immigrant community entering the South at this time. So a word about cultural capital. In my work, I use this concept, which is borrowed from sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, to get us a better understanding of class beyond just the monetary definitions of class identity. Cultural capital helps us think about the performative and embodied experiential elements of class, the embodied knowledge in many ways of class identity. And I think about, I try to expand on Bourdieu's understanding of cultural capital by looking intersectionally at the way in which class is gendered and raced simultaneously, and especially when we look at the way in which Jewish philanthropists in the South attempted to uplift and to protect the children of their poor co-religionists. Using this expansive lens of cultural capital helps us understand the ways in which middle-class identities could be cultivated in a space, especially a space of incredible cultural transformation and, as I mentioned before, racial precarity at the turn of the 20th century. And one of the things I found, and I'm happy to talk about this more, is that even though the two orphan homes were quite different from each other in many ways, they were similar in that the Southern orphan homes were the best. They were better than the non-Jewish homes. They were better than the Northern Jewish homes. And by that, I mean they were spaces that really tried to emulate a sense of home for these impoverished children. This is not to say that these children were happy as orphans, but when I call them orphans of fortune, I mean that comparatively speaking, these Southern Jewish orphans were really quite fortunate to land where they did. So first of all, the first one to be established was in New Orleans, the New Orleans Jewish Widows and Orphans Home, established in 1850s, which was in response to the yellow fever epidemics, which had killed a substantial portion of the population, orphaning many children. It originated as a home to also serve the needs of Jewish widows, but very soon thereafter, after it opened, they moved the widows to another location because there were so many children in need of a space to be. The New Orleans home serviced, I believe, 7 states. So the Jews of 7 states surrounding that area, including Louisiana, were sent to this home after its establishment. The Atlanta Hebrew Orphans Home was established much later in 1889, and it was directly a result of fundraising by B'nai B'rith. This home serviced 5 different southern states. So between the two of them, they covered the entire former Confederacy in terms of who they were protecting and who they were rescuing. So these two homes, one thing they have in common, you can tell by their structures are built to maximize a sense of grandeur and to emulate a sense of middle class or upper class cultural capital. They were also deliberately built in middle class, prosperous neighborhoods so that the children in the homes, rather than just being sheltered within the home's walls, could be encouraged to socialize with elite members of the Jewish community. So these children were actively encouraged to hang out with, to play baseball with their neighbors in the neighborhood. They were also encouraged to attend the synagogues nearby. For Atlanta, the Reform Temple was a quick walk down the street. So these kids were actively encouraged to be out there in the community. But they were discouraged from socializing with their poor co-religionists. So family members who live nearby who could be deemed a bad influence or who were not adequately assimilated or educated were always under suspicion in terms of being able to continue to socialize with these children. These homes were very careful about who they allowed their children to hang out with. I want to emphasize the extent to which these homes offered forms of recreation for the children. This was not the norm across the United States in terms of orphan homes and what they had to offer. This is an example of girls playing basketball on the basketball court at the Atlanta Hebrew Orphans home. Both of these homes had spaces for the children to play. They had baseball diamonds. They had outdoor opportunities for recreation. They took the children on fishing trips. As I showed you in a picture earlier, there was a skating rink at the Atlanta home. Another one of the orphans' former inmates at the Atlanta home, Al Garber, who ended up becoming one of the trustees of the organization much later in life when he became quite a success, actually said, from what I've heard of orphanages, we lived at a country club. He's one of the few others to leave behind an oral history of his experience at the home. It was not always sunshine. It was not always a happy experience to be an orphan, but these homes did their best to keep these children, to allow these children to be children, to experience life as children. I want to emphasize, too, that the children were socialized, and this comes back to cultural capital. They were trained in the gender distribution of labor. So you have the girls who are taught the scientific principles of home management in state-of-the-art kitchens. So these homes really did their best to try to provide for their children the opportunity to become properly trained as young ladies, as future mothers who knew how to cook. Similarly, the boys were trained in the workshop, and I want to emphasize the extent to which cultural capital involves performing gender properly. And in the South, it was of vital importance that girls were ladies and that men were manly men, specifically against pernicious stereotypes of Jewishness or Jewish men being unmanly. It was very important in these Southern homes that these orphan boys were trained to be good carpenters and to be farmers and to know how to maintain a home. Gender is a very important part of the cultural capital that these children were exposed to. You can also see how there's somewhat, and this is where there's a little bit of divergence in these homes. This is an image from the New Orleans home of some of the older girls. There were different spaces of sociability often for the children. Like there was a girls' playground at the New Orleans home where the girls played separate from the boys. The kids were a little bit more integrated. At the Atlanta home, you can tell they're all roller skating together. It doesn't really matter that much there. So there's a little bit of difference in terms of how they police the gender divide in an effort to ensure purity, to keep the kids separate. But also to socialize them in their proper roles as future adult Jewish citizens who were to be proper ladies and gentlemen of the South. In the 1920s, the New Orleans home instituted a new form of instituting family norms with the children. So throughout the early 20th century, there were a lot of nationwide studies on the way in which orphan homes actually weren't very healthy or salubrious effects on young children. And so there was a lot of criticism of orphanages, and the response by these two was to build in creative new ways of instituting family life in the institution. So the New Orleans home really took this to an extreme by bringing in especially their trustees and matrons or honorary matrons who were the wives of their trustees to come in and to have dinner with the children, to sit at these well-appointed dining tables with simple but elegant place settings so that the children would learn which fork to eat the salad with, and how to eat with their napkin on their lap. The children would be dressed elegantly, simply, but these were very important, vital exercises in training these children how to survive in a space where being proper, knowing how to emulate middle-class cultural capital was vitally important. Keep in mind that most of these children were children of immigrants whose parents didn't even speak English. So learning to speak English, learning how to perform as a good American citizen was absolutely vital, and learning how to sit at to set a well-appointed table and to produce a proper meal as a young woman was so incredibly important. And members of the middle class and elite Jewish communities in both cities were very active participants in this philanthropic venture in training these children how to be members of their community. So this comes back to the sort of methodological silences that I mentioned before. I want to come back to that opening vignette and the experience of what it was like and how do we capture the full nuances of the way in which the children in the home were cultivated into ideal citizens, and who was it in the home who was doing that cultivation. Well, when we look at the official images from the home, and these are mostly images that I've taken from newsletters. I mentioned that the New Orleans home has lost most of their records, very, very tragically. But what they do have are these newsletters that would go out to their donors, that would circulate among their community to inform the New Orleans Jewish community that they were doing good work, and to encourage them to contribute in some way, either financially or to volunteer at the home. And so these were images designed to inspire the community to contribute to the home. But what I was trying to get a sense of was the extent to which race is part of cultural capital. How these young children, the children of immigrants who had not been in the nation during the Civil War, who didn't quite understand the logic of Jim Crow segregation. This was a mission to allow these children to learn how to conduct themselves as indisputably white members of the Southern community. So Martha Hodes, who is also a historian, has written, "Absences are harder to interpret than their more tangible opposites. Certainly the archive is full of tangible photographic images of what it was like to be a child in these homes. But I discovered it was very hard to find out more about people like Fanny Young, the cook at the Hueber Orphan Home, and other people whose labor was absolutely vital to the cultivation of these children, to their protection and their uplift, and yet almost invisible in the extant records of these institutions. So I had to look very closely, and I had to pay attention. So, first, and I have so many images to show, this is an image from the New Orleans home nursery. This was part of the newsletter that would go out to donors. What do we notice about this image? Well, these are the youngest children in the New Orleans home, and they're hanging out in a room, and there's nobody there. They're just hanging out. So who's watching them? And I love this picture because it was captioned, our youngest inmates. It's a very joyful little picture of the kids just hanging out. That's a 2-year-old or maybe even a 1-year-old sitting on the ground. Nobody's taking care of them. Who do we think was watching these children? Well, they were black women who were taking care of these children. But their names were not recorded in any of the records from the New Orleans home. The only reason I could find out anything about Fanny Young was because I read the oral history, and then I looked through the census to find some record of who she was, and then I tracked her down. But the New Orleans home doesn't list the names of the many African American women who were there to take care of the children, to feed the children, to clothe the children. So how did I know that African American women were taking care of these babies? Well, I had to look really deeply. I had to scramble around through the archives, and I eventually found in the institutional records a report from 1925 criticizing the institution for exposing its babies and toddlers to uncultured Black women when emerging standards of childcare dictated that they most needed exposure to the channels of culture and education. So here's a quote from the report to the Child Welfare League of America, and they sent a Jewish social worker there every year to assess the quality of care that was being offered at the New Orleans home. So they noted, "It is quite obvious that the colored maids who assist in the nursery are largely responsible for the activities of the children. The pre-kindergarten group are having almost nothing in the way of mental stimulation." So, unlike Fanny Young of the Atlanta home, these workers were unnamed, so I couldn't find their names. What I did find occasionally was ledgers that would list a salary, and then it would say colored maid, and then a very low salary. They didn't board in the home, as did some people, like Fanny Young, I think, lived for a while at the New Orleans home, as did the gardener, who's also an African American. But what's clear to me from looking closer at the pictures is that the influence of African American women was absolutely vital to the protection and the upkeep of these children. And I would also argue to the inculcation of a certain kind of racialized cultural capital that revealed to these children the extent to which they were consumers rather than providers of a certain kind of labor, affective labor. That is labor of care. So the labor that unpaid parents give to their children, that's affective labor. These are paid workers, but they're among the lowest paid workers. We can also look here at this image that I showed you earlier from the well-appointed tables, where occasionally the matrons or official or honorary matrons from the community would come in to socialize with the children and to introduce them to middle-class mores. But if we look really carefully here at the very small children's table, here's one of the women who is missing from that earlier picture. If we continue to look closely at the images of the young women, and these may be from the Atlanta home, I can't remember, but it's a very fuzzy, pixelated picture. I did my best to try to reproduce it. In the kitchen was always an African American cook to help train these young girls in the way to do authentic cooking, authentic Southern cooking, and to make sure that they knew what they were doing in the kitchen. So as supervisors and also as teachers of how to be a good wife and a good mother, how to get around in the kitchen. We don't know these women's names, we just know that they were there, and sometimes we can find them if we look really closely at these images. So if we look back, here again is the girls' playground in the New Orleans home, and I think this is around 1910 or so. We have to get in really close to see there again is another African American caregiver, supervisor of the young children in the playground. So along with these pictures and these clues, and these are probably just a few because I don't even know how many other photographs were lost in Hurricane Katrina and other natural disasters in New Orleans. But in these photographs and the clues that if you look really carefully you can find in the institutional records and in Simon Scher's remembrance about Mrs. Young, all of this reflects the widespread and continuous presence of Black women in Southern white children's upbringing and the ambivalent intimacies marked by that complex pairing of nurture and affection with hierarchy and subjugation, a dialectic that historian Eric Lott calls love and theft, that characterized race relations in the Jim Crow South, as the laws prohibiting public interactions between whites and Blacks grew more rigid in the South. Intimate interface between Black women and their white employers continued to flourish in private spaces, and children, in particular, were common recipients of Black women's affective labor. This physically and emotionally demanding work was as necessary to maintaining respectably clean and orderly domestic spaces as it was to nurturing the young. And although they were prohibited from occupying public spaces designated for whites only, Black women stood as benign, even beloved figures essential to the process of reproducing a white citizenry in the South. Such care and the quotidian lessons in white middle-class respectability that accompanied it helped imbue orphan inmates with a sense of themselves as racially privileged citizens of the South. Even the poorest orphan or half orphan, many of these kids were actually half orphans. I can talk about that more if you all are interested. But even the poorest child learned to see herself as a consumer rather than as a performer of certain forms of affective menial labor. So the girls might learn how to be excellent cooks, how to navigate a Southern kitchen, but they also learned to outsource labor like doing the laundry or taking care of very small children. So poor Jewish children therefore became accustomed to Black women's presence as sources of affection and warmth, as well as of particularly undesirable forms of work. But perhaps most crucially, they provided training in the complex performance of racial dominance that would help ensure their survival in the world beyond the institution's walls. Thank you. So I know I went through a lot of this really fast, so if you all have any questions, I'm happy to talk more about exactly how all of this worked and what the kids' lives were like. I have a lot more to say about that. Yes, ma'am.
How old would the youngest child be accepted, and how old were they when they got to leave?
That's a great question.
Were arrangements made when they left?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that question. The question is, how old were the children? Like, what's the minimum age, and then how old were they when they left? So, each institution had rules about the minimum age. So I remember, for instance, I think the minimum age was something like 4 or 5, but that rule was very often bent, especially in instances where there was a family in extreme need, where, for instance, a mother had passed away, leaving behind a bunch of children, and the father couldn't possibly be trusted to take care of his own children back in the day. So that's why many of these kids were half orphans. But in many cases, those laws, those rules would be bent, like in cases where a 3-year-old, and you can tell from these pictures, some of these kids are very tiny. Those are little tiny children there. I think New Orleans, over time, agreed to take much younger children. So I think their limit may have been around 2 or 3. I think the Hueber Orphan Home of Atlanta had a slightly older limit. Now, in terms of the age when they left, it was usually around when they were graduating from high school. So when they were teenagers, when they were around 16 or 17, they were expected to get jobs, to go to college. This is another thing that I think was really amazing about these orphan homes, whereas a lot of other orphan homes around the nation did not focus as much on education. These children had to go to school. They were obligated to go to school. And in many cases, even for the girls, and I'm saying this because early 20th century, it wasn't taken for granted that a girl would go to college or even finish high school. These institutions provided funding for these kids to get college educations if they wanted them. They didn't always want them. But for the most part, in answer to your question again, the age limit was somewhere between 3 and 17. And also another layer to this was really interesting in terms of the gendering of cultural capital. When young women left the homes, they were assigned members of the community to serve as mentors and supervisors to make sure they stayed on the straight and narrow, to help them find jobs, to help them be proper young women. Boys were taken care of as well, but they weren't quite as vigilantly policed as were young ladies when they left the institutions. Yeah, way in the back.
Was there any form of Jewish education in the
absolutely, absolutely. A form of Jewish education, yes, absolutely. The children received Hebrew education. They were mostly educated in Reform tradition. The kids at the Atlanta home mostly went to the Reform temple right down the street. The ones in the New Orleans home had more of a choice. I believe there were 3 or 4 different synagogues in the area that they could choose from. But yes, they did go to synagogue and they did get Hebrew education. Now, whether they did went through confirmation, which was sort of like an equivalent to like bar bat mitzvah, was more up to the children themselves. I think in Atlanta they mostly had confirmations rather than bar and bat mitzvah. But absolutely, Jewish education was really important. Although I would say because it was in the South, there was more of an emphasis on reform. And many of these children came from Orthodox homes. So that was really a point of contention. And I argue in my book that that was a big piece of the puzzle of cultural capital, that I'm making it sound like it's a very positive thing. It's actually quite contentious. There's a contentious side, a paternalistic side to cultural capital, where the assimilated, predominantly Reform, mostly German-descended Jewish population that were the stewards of these children felt like they knew best in terms of cultivating middle-class values in these children. Yes, ma'am. Ooh, good question. So first of all, relationships with like family members in the community who may have been there and sort of what were the rules around that, and then secondly, how to ensure that they spoke English and all of that. On the second front, I just know that the schooling they received was in English. So like the Atlanta children mostly went to Atlanta public schools. So they would just walk, they'd all go off walking to the school and go to be integrated into the public school system. In New Orleans, they established in the early 20th century the Newman School, which became it's an incredible school. It's a private school that's pretty hard to get into nowadays. So those kids were definitely trained to speak and learn English and to learn liberal arts. To your other question, this is really interesting. I don't have a hard and fast answer. There was not really a rule on either of the institutions against socializing with your landslight. And in fact, if there were members of the family who could prove that they were respectable, by which I mean had a good job, contributed regularly, so like if there was a father who paid his monthly allowance of usually around $5 to support his child who was in the orphan home, he would be allowed to continue and visit the child and whatnot. But there were so many cases where family members who were poor, unacculturated, impoverished, and didn't contribute, who were basically told they couldn't have any contact with the children. So there's a lot of heartbreaking stuff, especially because of the Atlanta home records. I can look at the social work records and see where these kinds of conflicts took place between the institution trying to protect the children and raise them to be respectable adults, and family members who were thought to be a bad influence. And this happens a lot. In New Orleans, it's harder for me to track because I don't have the social work records, but I imagine probably something similar happened. Way in the back? Oh my gosh, that's a great question. So a lot of these people would have been like socialists, definitely left-leaning, radical type folks who were in these immigrant communities. So very oddly, and I'm sure there's a much bigger story to this and I just don't know it, oddly, what I discovered in my deep dive into the archives of Atlanta was that the family members it was a mixed bag. There were some family members who were very invested in racial segregation, who participated in racial segregation. You can see that in the records. And then there were other families who were judged to be bad influences because they lived and socialized with members of African American communities. So in like Atlanta, for instance, at one point, one of the neighborhoods where East European immigrants settled, and where actually a lot of Sephardim also settled, was multiracial. So it was actually a very like diverse community. And members on the board at the home did not approve of the children living in those communities because they would be socializing with African Americans. But it's a real mixed bag. You get both. You get some people who are very much ready to adapt to the color lines principles, and then you have other people who kind of like, you can tell they don't quite understand this color line. They're just going to live where they live, and they're going to live in the community that they can afford. But certainly the people who were trying to raise the orphans did not want the orphan children to be, and this is a major irony, especially in light of what I just showed you all. They're being raised by black women, but the children are not allowed to socialize with black children. So yeah, but I don't have a really good answer to that. I'm not so sure about the political inclinations. Yes?
What percentage of, if you know, of some of these children were actually adopted by people Jewish people who lived in the community?
So I don't,
So raising them.
yeah, this is a great question. How many kids were adopted as opposed to being in the orphan home? It's a long story. I don't know percentages, but, and this is one of the points of divergence between the two institutions. I mentioned that early 20th century, starting around 1909, 1910, the larger set of principles around child care and early childhood education start to move away from institutionalization. So they start to criticize the institution and say that children really need to be raised in homes. So the Atlanta home immediately starts to adapt. They start sending the children off to foster homes in the community. They do extensive interviews to make sure that the homes are going to be appropriate places to raise them. They call it fostering, so they don't really call it adoption. They also do mother's subsidies. So if you're a mother who really doesn't have enough money to support your children, especially if you're a widow, they give the woman a monthly subsidy to take care of her children so that the children can be raised with their mother. New Orleans, on the complete other side of the spectrum, until the very end, maintained that its institution was the very best space for the children. So they did not believe in subsidizing mothers. They didn't believe in fostering. And so they maintained an institutional space. So that's one place where these two communities were really divergent in their approach. But in terms of adoption, I'm really not sure. Not sure. Yes?
Part of assimilation.
Yeah, no, it's such a hard question. It's a good one. It's a great question. So to what was the position of Jews in the South? A lot of this is taking place around the time that you mentioned the Ku Klux Klan. The resurgence happens in response to, well, because of Leo Frank's trial, and then Leo Frank is lynched by the so-called Knights of Mary Phagan that really are the Klan in 1915. So this is in Marietta, Georgia, just north of Atlanta. So a lot of this is happening against this backdrop where Jewishness is quite precarious in the South. Now, I don't know if I'm willing to say that the South is necessarily more anti-Semitic, because there are many scholars who have done a lot of research about the extent to which Jewish Southerners just kind of fit right in, like blended right in. In a lot of ways, until that second wave of immigration happens, Jewish Southerners were just Southerners. They were just as Southern as any. And many people will argue that. I feel like that's sort of the dominant paradigm coming from Southern Jewish history, is that until that second wave of immigration, Jews were really good at just being Southern. It's when you get that approximately 40,000 people coming from not just Eastern Europe, but you also get a pretty big wave also of Sephardic Jews coming into different southern cities as well. And it becomes kind of a mess. And I really do think, and especially in just what I see from these social work records, traces of that concern, that precarity, that sense that Jewishness is somehow liminal in relationship to the color line. And certainly you can read it in the records that the boards of trustees of these institutions are talking about in their records, about the urgency of making sure that these children, these future citizens and future, members of the community are going to reflect well, that they're not just are they not going to burden the public purse, but that they're going to reflect well on Jewishness in general. So I wouldn't necessarily say the South is more anti-Semitic. What I would say is that racial formation in the South, at least at this point in time, is more precarious. It's more immediately threatening. That's what Rayford Logan means by the nadir of race relations. Most of the lynchings took place in the former Confederacy. Race riots, obviously they happen in the North as well as the South, but more of the most explicit violence was in the South. And absolutely, Southern Jews felt that. And I like to say that benevolence, that the act of benevolence, obviously we celebrate these incredible exemplars of benevolence that these institutions represent, right? But at the same time, we can see how benevolence is absolutely necessary to Jewish survival in a space where it's not 100% clear whether Jews are living on the right side of the color line or not. So that's a good question. I don't know if other people have ideas about that. Yes?
Are these buildings still there?
They're not. Tragically. I've always wanted to see, I don't even have many pictures of the inside of these buildings, but they haven't been around for a long time. I've spoken to people who have been inside them, who have remembrances of them. I do know that of the two, so that this one, so the New Orleans home, apparently it had the lobby had a chandelier in it, and it was really beautifully appointed. It was actually deliberately appointed to look like a really nice, wealthy home, like you were walking into a home. It was made to feel welcoming. I think the Atlanta home was somewhat less so, a little bit more institutional. But you can tell, but it doesn't really, to me, it doesn't look much like, and it looks more like a school to me. And especially when we consider that the grounds have all these places for kids to play. And it doesn't have a big wall around it. The kids were encouraged to go out into the community to make friends with the next door neighbors. So I wish they were still there.
Were these uniquely Southern things, or were Hebrew orphans home all over the country?
Oh, good question. So Hebrew orphan homes were all over the country. There were multiple Jewish orphan homes in New York, for instance, Philadelphia. I think the first was, I can't remember if it was in Philadelphia or New York. But Hebrew orphan homes. Cleveland, Ohio was one of the really big ones. Belfair. Actually, Belfair, I think, was, until these Southern orphan homes came into their own, the Cleveland Hebrew orphan home was thought to be the best. That was the one that all others should emulate. But all the research that I've done on Cleveland shows that these Southern homes did it best. They served the children the best food. They educated the children most thoroughly. They made the children bathe every single day, if you can believe it. There were some orphan homes in New York where you were lucky if you got a bath every week. So this is a really different kind of space when we're thinking about the care of dependent and poor children at the turn of the century. Yes. That's great. I can't remember the exact number. Several thousands. The New Orleans home actually was bigger, so several thousands went through the New Orleans home. I can't remember. Maybe 1,000. I can look it up and let you know. I can't remember exactly how many. Wait, what was the other question?
Like the heyday of the period of what you're describing.
Not quite. It's not really the heyday. I would say it's more the late part of the 19th century is more the heyday for them. And I say that because starting in the 20th century, the Atlanta home was doing more fostering and more mother subsidies. Yes, probably for New Orleans, they did grow because there were so many more immigrants coming in who were having difficulty surviving in this new space, finding sustainable work. There wasn't a social safety net available during this time in the nation. There wasn't, aid to families with dependent children or anything like that. So if you lost your spouse or you fell on hard times, you lost your job, these were the places that provided you with a little help. Sometimes people who fell on hard times would put their children temporarily into the homes in the hope that they could then get them back very soon. And that actually did happen for some families, but I have a feeling those were not the norm. I think for the most part, families, a father might bring his 3 children in and say, I'm going to get them out as soon as I can, and he just wouldn't be able to find sustainable work. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. They really weren't. They weren't sites for adoption. They were meant to be homes. So they were, and definitely a temporary home, but from what I understand, the people, the stewards of these homes intended for these kids to find a home within those walls. And on that note, one of the really interesting things I discovered in doing this research, especially through the Atlanta home, a lot of these kids stayed in touch with the superintendents. There's just filing cabinets full of these letters where the kids are writing back to the superintendents saying, thank you so much for everything you did. You're like a mother to me or a father to me. These children really felt so much gratitude to these homes for what they gave them. And they did, I will say too that they made quite an effort to get kids fostered where they could, but that wasn't always super successful either. I think it was hard for a lot of these kids having gone through so much trauma. It was hard for them to just meld right into a family. Well, what replaced them? Okay, I know more about the Atlanta home. So during the 20s and 30s, and it was really in the 30s that the home decided they're going to go completely non-residential. And through fostering and mother subsidies, they did just that. So they basically discontinued their residency right during the Depression, actually. And as a result of that, they morphed into what is now known as the Jewish Educational Loan Fund, JELF. JELF continues for decades and decades to provide no-interest loans to Jewish youth who are trying to get their college education. So there's an incredible legacy in this home of taking care of kids, of young people who are struggling, who don't have enough to pay for their education. So their legacy is certainly very long. The New Orleans home established the Newman School, I believe, in 1902 or 3. They opened the doors. This home stayed a residential space, I believe, into the 40s. The Newman School today remains one of the most celebrated private schools in the South. It attracts all kinds of kids, Jewish, non-Jewish, and they will offer free education to Jewish orphans. So every now and then I'll meet somebody who went to the Newman School because they were a Jewish orphan, and they get this wonderful education and usually go on to do incredible things. So both of these institutions have left a really long tail in terms of their legacies. One more question? Mm-hmm. Yes, I would say absolutely. Leo Frank shook the Jewish South in a major way. When that happened, when he was accused of murder and also some possible sexual assault, on a 14-year-old girl. And Governor Slayton commuted his sentence. He was going to be sentenced to death, and the governor at the very last minute commuted his sentence, and in response to that, what would become the Ku Klux Klan broke him out of jail and lynched him in Marietta, Georgia. I absolutely think that the lynching of Leo Frank had a major impact on a sense of worry and precarity and anxiety among Southern Jews. Absolutely. You can see in some of the records and some of the meetings and the boards of trustees, especially of the Atlanta home, where they're talking about the need to ensure that the children were well prepared to go out into that world. So these people had a sense of mission that was based on not just social uplift, but also on survival. And I absolutely think that was true. Absolutely. They were terrified. I have less of a sense of how people felt in New Orleans, but you can see through looking at the Jewish newspapers that were in circulation throughout the South that people were paying attention to what happened with Leo Frank. And that really shook them. Leo Frank was born in Texas. He was a Southerner. He was married to a Georgia woman. You know, he was Southern, and yet in that whole thing, he was framed as if he was some kind of outsider, some kind of criminal. What's that? Nope. He did live in New York. He was educated at Cornell. Yes, he was educated at Cornell, but he was a Texan. Anyway, I need to wrap it up, but I will be here if anybody wants to chat with me. Thank you so much for your kind attention and your questions. Appreciate it.